She knocked only to survive. He opened the door just to pass another night in silence. But fate had other plans. Eliza and Jonas were strangers bound by loss, until danger forced them to become something more. Not just survivors, not just protectors, family. The wind screamed through the valley like a wounded beast. Snow came sideways now, slashing across the dying light, devouring everything in its path. No trails, no markers, just white and more white. Eliza Cooper pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders, though the threadbare wool did little to fight the cold that gnawed at her bones. Beside her, 3 small figures trudged in silence, heads down, faces hidden beneath scarves and worn hats. Nathan, the oldest at 10, kept his jaw clenched tight, refusing to show weakness. Lila, barely 8, clung to his arm, her steps faltering more and more with each passing hour. And Ben, sweet, tender Ben, just 5, whimpered softly as he clung to his mother's skirt, his tiny mittens stiff with ice. Eliza's legs burned. Her lips cracked every time she whispered for them to keep going. She didn't know how much farther they could make it. She wasn't sure if she would make it, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Not after Matthew, not after what he'd said as he rode away, leaving them stranded at Bitter Hollow with nothing but half a sack of flour and his sneer. "You'll figure it out, Eliza. You always do." She could still hear his voice in the dark, could still taste the betrayal when she realized he hadn't just left for supplies. He'd left for good. And so she walked, through the storm, through the ache, through the desperate silence, until she saw it, a light. It flickered faintly in the distance, half hidden by swaying pines and a heavy curtain of snow. A cabin. Eliza's knees buckled in relief, but she forced herself upright. "Come on," she whispered hoarsely to the children. "Just a little more." They stumbled the last 100 yards together, collapsing against the door. Eliza's knuckles were numb as she raised her hand and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time. Her voice cracked as she tried to call out, but only a raw rasp escaped her throat. Then finally the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, shadowed by firelight behind him. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a thick coat hanging heavy off his frame. His face was carved with sharp lines and a beard dusted with gray. But it was his eyes that struck Eliza. Cold, wary, and tired. For a long second he said nothing. Neither did she, but words weren't needed. Not when 3 frozen children clung to their mother's skirt, shivering violently. The man's jaw tensed. He stepped aside. "Get in!" Eliza didn't hesitate. She ushered the children inside, practically dragging Ben across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing out the scream of the wind. Warmth hit them like a wave, the crackle of the hearth, the faint smell of pine and smoke. The man moved briskly, pulling chairs closer to the fire. "Sit. Get warm." Eliza obeyed, unwrapping scarves and peeling stiff coats from her children's tiny bodies. Nathan helped Lila, rubbing her arms while Ben buried himself into Eliza's lap. The man disappeared into another room, returning moments later with thick blankets and a kettle. "Drink," he said, pouring steaming water into chipped mugs. "Ain't much, but better than the cold." Eliza accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping numb fingers around it as she stole a glance at their host. He moved like a man who didn't much like company. Everything about him, from the set of his jaw to the way his boots thudded on the floorboards, spoke of solitude. Still, he hadn't turned them away. "Thank you," Eliza managed, her voice raw from wind and fear. The man grunted. He stirred the fire, sending sparks leaping up the chimney. "You come far?" he asked, finally breaking the heavy quiet. Eliza hesitated, but something about his steady presence, the way he didn't press, made her answer. 3 days, she whispered. "East of Bitter Hollow. Wagon broke. Walked the rest." The man didn't blink. "Why?" The word hit harder than she expected. Simple. Director. She swallowed, eyes darting toward her children, now huddled and half asleep near the hearth. "Left," she said finally. "Had to." That seemed enough for him. He didn't pry. Instead, he nodded slightly and leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "Name's Jonas Hale," he offered after a pause. Eliza Cooper, she replied softly. She glanced at the children. Nathan, Lila, Ben. Jonas nodded again. His face remained impassive, but his gaze softened, just a little, as he watched Ben's small hand clutching the hem of his mother's skirt, even in sleep. You're safe here, Jonas said quietly. Storm's got nowhere to go tonight, and neither do you. Relief hit Eliza so hard she almost sobbed, but she held it together. She always had. Instead, she met his eyes and whispered, Thank you. Jonas only turned back to the fire, his silhouette glowing faintly in the flicker of the flames. Outside, the storm howled against the cabin walls, but inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Eliza and her children were safe, for now. Morning came slow. The storm had not passed, only softened. Its howl now reduced to a dull hiss like a snake coiled outside the walls, waiting for weakness. Eliza stirred first. Her back ached from sleeping upright near the hearth, but her eyes went immediately to the children. Nathan, Lila, and Ben were still bundled in borrowed quilts, their cheeks pink now with heat instead of cold. Ben's tiny hand was resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, and Nathan had shifted sometime in the night to curl protectively around both. They were safe, for now. Eliza rose carefully, her legs stiff, and glanced around the cabin. The place was plain, but not without care. Tools were lined neatly along one wall. A shelf of books, worn but organized, stood near the door. The table was scarred with use, but clean. She found Jonas outside. He stood on the porch, axe in hand, splitting kindling in clean, practiced motions. Snow still fell lightly, dusting his shoulders, but he paid it no mind. Eliza hesitated, then stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. You don't have to do all that for us, she said softly. Jonas didn't look at her as he spoke. Not doing it for you, he replied flatly. Doing it for the stove. Stove don't care who's hungry, just needs wood to burn. Eliza bit back a smile. She recognized the type, men who wore their kindness behind rough words and harder hands. Still, she didn't push. Instead, she stepped off the porch and began gathering the split wood into her arms. Jonas paused, watching her. Could have stayed inside, he said. I've been sitting too long, Eliza replied simply. Feels better to move? He nodded once, a silent approval. Together they worked, neither speaking much, but neither needing to. By the time the woodpile was replenished, the sky had lightened to a dull silver. Jonas jerked his chin toward the door. Coffee's probably still warm. Inside, the children had begun to stir. Nathan yawned and stretched. Lila sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Ben clung to the quilt, peeking out cautiously. Jonas poured coffee into 2 tin cups, black, bitter, and hot. Eliza took hers gratefully, wrapping cold fingers around the warmth. You planning to move on when the storm breaks? He asked after a moment. Eliza hesitated. I don't know. I thought I would. Had family west, or thought I did. But letters stopped coming long before winter. Jonas didn't press. Instead, he simply nodded and sipped his coffee. You ain't the first to come through here thinking West held all the answers, he said quietly. Most of the time, all you find out, there's just more questions. Eliza met his eyes across the table. For a fleeting second, something passed between them. An understanding. They were both ghosts in a way, people left behind by the world. As the day wore on, the children settled. Nathan helped Jonas with the animals, hauling hay and breaking ice in the trough. Jonas showed him how to hold the axe, how to swing without wasting strength. Lila stayed inside, helping Eliza patch torn mittens and prepare a thin stew. She asked quiet questions about Jonas. Why he lived alone. Why he didn't have a family. Ben trailed Jonas everywhere. The little boy asked endless questions, his voice small but eager. What's that knife for? Do bears come here? Can I have a horse someday? Jonas, to his credit, answered every single one. No, he said at one point, gesturing to the gun hanging by the door. That's for bears, knives for wood, or stubborn knots. By evening, something had shifted in the cabin. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, familiar. The children laughed softly as they played near the fire. Eliza smiled as she stirred the stew, glancing every now and then at Jonas, who sat whittling a small figure. a bird, delicate and precise. She noticed the way his hands worked, slow and careful, as if shaping more than just wood. "You carve well," she said quietly. Jonas glanced up. "Something to do when the wind won't stop howling." Eliza watched him a moment longer. "I think," she began carefully, "you're kinder than you let on." Jonas didn't smile. Not exactly, but his lips twitched slightly, and that alone felt like a victory. Night fell heavy and slow. After supper, the children curled up near the hearth again, already half asleep. Eliza and Jonas sat at the table, the lamp casting soft golden light between them. Outside, the storm had lessened, but the cold still pressed against the windows. Eliza's fingers curled around her cup as she stared into the flickering shadows. "Thank you," she said suddenly, voice low but sure. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For letting us stay. For not asking too many questions." Jonas looked away, his gaze settling on the sleeping children. "Didn't seem like you needed more questions," he murmured. "Seemed like you needed rest." Eliza felt something tight loosen in her chest. "I did," she whispered. For a moment silence settled again. Not heavy, not empty. Just easy. Jonas rose, stretching his broad shoulders. "Storm's breaking," he said. "Tomorrow you can head out if you want." Eliza nodded slowly, but something about the thought made her stomach twist. Head out. Go back into a world that had left her battered and alone. Or stay. But that was a thought for another night. For now they were safe. For now the fire burned steady. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza Cooper allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, safety wasn't temporary after all. Morning broke with a pale, uncertain light. For the first time in days, the sky held no snow. It hung heavy and gray. But still, it was clear. The storm had passed. Jonas Hale stepped onto the porch, boots crunching softly against the hardened snow. He could smell change on the air. Not just spring trying to find its way through winter's grip, but something else. Inside, Eliza and the children were already stirring. Nathan was rolling up quilts, eager to help. Lila sat braiding her doll's yarn hair while humming softly. Ben followed Jonas everywhere that morning, asking about the animals, about the trees, about life beyond snow. It felt normal. Too normal. Jonas knew better than to trust normal. By noon, Eliza stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her skirt, eyes turned toward the distant ridge where the trail disappeared into the pines. "Do you think it's safe now?" she asked softly.